Now, Stravinsky had done a couple of American concert tours prior to emigrating. In 1937, he was in Hollywood, where George Antheil had been engaged by Paramount Studios to compose the score for Cecil B. DeMille's latest film, The Plainsman, with Gary Cooper. A great gig for Antheil, though studio politics would soon complicate his prospects there. But it was during this 1937 tour that Stravinsky visited the Disney studios as an honored guest, where they said, by the way, Maestro, we're using your Rite of Spring for our new film, Fantasia. But don't worry, here's a check for $6,000 to cover any inconveniences, like the fact that we're going to chop it in half and rearrange it and add cartoon dinosaurs to all the fact is this was totally legal since there were no copyright agreements between America and Russian composers. So the $6,000 was a very nice gesture on Walt's part. That was a lot of money in 1937. And as mortified as Stravinsky may have been, Fantasia introduced the Rite of Spring to generations of music lovers, present company included. And conductor Leopold Stokowski worked his usual magic with the music, including this astounding sound effect added to the French horn glissandos in the Dance to the Earth section. Sounds like a few dinos loose back there in the orchestra. Wow. But in addition to business matters during this tour, Stravinsky was showered with attention by the Hollywood film community's arts aficionados, including Douglas Fairbanks, Marlene Dietrich, Charlie Chaplin, and Edward G. Robinson. And speaking of Cecil DeMille, in the Ten Commandments, didn't Edward G. Robinson utter the immortal line, "Where's your Messiah now, wise guy?" Maybe I might be thinking of something else. But now, in 1940, with Stravinsky permanently residing in Hollywood, the film offers came fast and furious. But I'll tell you right now that none of the projects ever worked out as planned. For example, in 1941, Stravinsky worked on Columbia Pictures' wartime drama, The Commandos Strike at Dawn, with actor Paul Muni. He was very popular at the time. He starred in the Best Picture of 1937. The Life of Emile Zola. What a great picture. If you like great courtroom dramas, it's it. All right. And in that film, Zola's best friend Paul Cézanne was portrayed by Russian actor Vladimir Sokolov, who was one of Stravinsky's best friends in Hollywood during this time. But I digress. Commandos Strike at Dawn took place in Norway, but the film deal fell apart, and Stravinsky later used sections of his score in his 4 Norwegian moods. Some say modes. There were 2 offers from 20th Century Fox, one for Orson Welles' Jane Eyre, the other for the Song of Bernadette, from the novel by Franz Werfel, who was married to Gustav Mahler's widow, Alma, at the time. I mean, what a time in the musical arts world. It's amazing. But I think the most interesting movie offer came from producer Samuel Goldwyn, who asked Stravinsky to write the score for his 1943 film, The North Star, written by Lillian Hellman, which dealt with Ukraine's heroic resistance to the Nazis. Ultimately, Aaron Copland would write the score. But Stravinsky's initial sketches were used for a most unusual work of his, inspired by the sound of peasant accordions accompanying the local folk dances. Stravinsky had previously explored this sound in his great ballet Petrushka from 1911, in the carnival scenes where he used the orchestra to imitate the sound of the accordion bellows, like so. And in the ghostly finale, so enter now, who else? Band leader Paul Whiteman, the man who had commissioned Gershwin's Rhapsody in Blue 20 years earlier. Incidentally, around this time, in 1943, Warner Brothers Film Studio approached Stravinsky about playing himself in a film to recreate the famous meeting in Paris when Gershwin asked to study with him. You may know about this. Gershwin said, "Maestro, I'd be so honored if I could please study with you." And Stravinsky said, "Young man, how much money did you earn last year?" And Gershwin said, oh, $200,000. And Stravinsky said, then perhaps I should study with you. It's true, I'm not making any of this up. At any rate, band leader Paul Whiteman had been after Stravinsky for years to write something for his band, but Igor always found a way to be too busy. But now, times being what they were, and the fee was good, so he found the time by taking his accordion sketches from the Ukrainian film and retooling them for his new Scherzo alla Russe. I know of a conductor who presented this work in concert, preceded by a demonstration of the way Stravinsky turns the orchestra into a giant accordion bellows. Here's that demo. That's the accompaniment. Now you add the three trumpets playing the melody in typical folk-like parallel triads. And you have a foot stomp in good time. But this is all from the full orchestral version. Stravinsky's original for Whiteman's band used a small string section, trumpets, and 4 saxophones playing the bellows figure, plus piano, guitar, a drum set. What a menial task, perhaps, for Stravinsky, but great fun for us. Well, I hope Whiteman felt that he got his money's worth. Once again, for prestige and cutting-edge novelty, you couldn't beat the name Stravinsky. And if he had aesthetic reservations about these commissions, the money was good, and he viewed each new project through his meticulous, analytical, neoclassic lens. And during the 30-plus years of his neoclassic period, the world would witness Stravinsky produce, among other things, a Bach-like miniature orchestral concerto, a grand Handelian oratorio on a classic Greek legend, a classically designed 4-movement symphony, a 3-act Mozartian opera complete with recitatives accompanied by the harpsichord. But what if, one day in 1942, the Ringling Brothers Circus in Madison Square Garden called and said, "Hey, maestro, we need a polka for our circus elephants"? How would Stravinsky's lofty, cerebral neoclassicism handle that one? And that was Schubert's March Militaire that just got trampled on there. Now, I'm no fan of elephants being used in circuses, but Stravinsky and the great choreographer George Balanchine teamed up and decided to make the best of this. The elephants wore tutus and they took it all in stride. But Stravinsky wasn't too embarrassed by his new Circus Polka because he later expanded it for full orchestra to earn some money. But for the original Ringling Brothers version, he had to score it for their circus band, a task which Stravinsky decided to pass on ultimately to the young, brilliant composer David Raksin. You know, the man who wrote the lovely theme from the film Laura. It was my father's all-time favorite tune. And some years ago, I spoke with Mr. Raksin about his instrumentation for Stravinsky's Polka. David was a lovely, witty, and insightful man, and he told me how he would show Stravinsky his circus band scoring page by page, to which the maestro, barely bothering to look, would say, "That's fine, fine, yeah, that's wonderful." He trusted David implicitly, and frankly, he wanted the whole thing to just go away after he got his check. Ladies and gentlemen, this story is about to get crazier, so stay with me. Speaking of elephants in New York, you may have heard of the famous impresario, entrepreneur, showman, producer, Billy Rose, sort of an urban Broadway Serge Diaghilev who was about to enter Stravinsky's life in 1944. Among Billy Rose's big productions was his grandiose, unwieldy musical Jumbo, which was produced in New York's massive Hippodrome Theater in 1935 with a book by Antheil's pal Ben Hecht, music by our pals Rodgers and Hart, with the orchestra led by, guess who, Paul Whiteman. These guys were everywhere, and I'm not making any of this up. And Jumbo himself actually appeared on stage. This is the show where Jimmy Durante is sneaking Jumbo out of the circus tent, and a cop says, "Hey buddy, where are you going with that elephant?" To which Jimmy responds, "What elephant, officer?" Anyway, in June of 1944, Billy Rose in New York sends Igor Stravinsky in Hollywood a telegram about a new show he's going to open at the end of the year. Now, whatever might this be about, you ask? Well, we will see. But what about George Antheil? Well, he's living in Hollywood, writing occasional film music, but making ends meet by using one of his many skills, as I listed in the beginning of this episode. He was writing for Esquire Publications, and in June of 1939, he writes an article entitled "Germany Never Had a Chance," which correctly predicted the major events that started World War II 3 months later. Now get this. As it turns out, George Antheil's younger brother Henry was working as an attaché to the American ambassador to Russia, and Henry actually reported directly to FDR in some cases. George and Henry Antheil had met for the Easter holiday in 1939 at their father's old shoe store in Trenton, where Henry passed on to George the inside information that George would use in his article, that Germany would attack Poland around September 1st, would later invade Russia, and Hitler would get, quote, his teeth kicked in, but only after a few dark years of Nazi victories, which would ultimately draw the U.S. into the conflict. George never saw his beloved brother again after that talk. Henry's plane mysteriously exploded over Estonia in June 1940, and soon after, George's sense of duty to assist in the war effort led to his meetings with actress Hedy Lamarr and their joint invention, the frequency-hopping, radio-controlled submarine torpedo, which was patented but never used by the Department of Defense. Again, and I'm serious this time about this, every word of this is true. It's just so unimaginable that all of this went into the creation of the music that we are going to hear. And here is where we begin to draw together the career paths and the output of Igor Stravinsky and George Antheil. Antheil was now a highly regarded war analyst for the Los Angeles Daily News, and he followed the daily radio reports with great diligence. But in addition to, or in spite of all of this, Antheil's burning desire was to compose serious music. And how fascinating that, as he listened and followed the progress of the war, he began to compose his Fourth Symphony as a response, an artistic and emotional outlet for his feelings about these monumental events. And bear in mind that his colleague Igor Stravinsky whose beloved Russia and France and all of Europe were being destroyed, while he enjoyed the safety and prosperity of America. He was writing polkas for circus elephants and, as we've seen, insisting that music has no capacity, no business expressing anything emotional, at least not for an artiste such as himself. Antheil, who wrote his Fourth Symphony, quote, in between a good deal of typewriter pounding, started it in July of 1942 on the day that the heroic British forces landed at El Alamein in Egypt and gave the Allies a major boost of morale by preventing the Nazis from advancing into the Middle East. And the symphony's main motto theme, which opens the work in stark octaves in the brass, has an exotic modal sound to it, rather flamboyant flourishes. Antheil may have been going for a modal mid-Eastern effect here. He and his wife had spent a lot of time in North Africa, in Tunisia, and he was fascinated by Moorish music. The music continues to alternate dark turbulence with unexpectedly cheery marching tunes. Antheil said that the entire future of the world hung in the balance as he listened to radio reports, wrote his news columns, and composed. And in the second movement, this motto theme is inverted. And if this isn't Spanish music, a lovely languid night in the gardens of Spain, I don't know what is. And if ever there was a Hollywood producer looking for a composer to write the score for a Spanish film, he need look no further. But it's the finale of Antheil's Fourth Symphony that I want to highlight here. It opens with a rather bombastic march with this accompaniment, over which the trumpets blast out this fanfare theme. Again, I hear an unmistakable Spanish flair to this. And when the trombones repeat the theme now, you'll hear the accompaniment become more dissonant, almost polytonal, you could say, with an E-flat seventh chord over what sounds like A major. So you get, okay, this is very similar to a certain chord combination from a certain ballet by a certain other composer who was always lurking in Antheil's background. This is very visceral, graphic music that evokes images of wartime newsreels, but which soon takes on a new lyrical quality in C major and a hint of the optimism that lies ahead. Again, there's that Spanish idiom. And a decade later, in 1953, Antheil would create a very successful ballet based on a Hemingway bullfight story called Capital of the World. But the finale of the Fourth Symphony continues. And it's not as if any of this is not totally predictable, okay? There was a very plaintive theme that was heard in the second movement. It was this. And here in the finale, after so much turbulent music, this theme reappears out of nowhere. But it's been transformed now into a glorious, sun-drenched processional in F-sharp major. A wonderful moment. Antheil then, as you heard, reverts to some goofy comic music that sounds like Shostakovich with the piano and xylophone. He was roundly criticized for this. But it still provides a nice contrast here. And this funny music is based on the actual motto theme of the symphony, which is... And the new music is... So there is some symphonic cohesion in this music. I once did a video for grade school students about World War II, and I used this, George Antheil, and the story of his composing this work. And during this funny comic music on the video, I actually used a cartoon, a Warner Brothers cartoon, where Daffy Duck clobbers Hitler over the head with a giant mallet, okay? But it made the point. The cartoon was a great morale booster during the war, as is Antheil's comic music here, thumbing his nose, or some such gesture, at the brutal Axis powers. And this parody music abruptly switches to another march, sunny, vigorous, again with parallel harmonies in strings and trumpets, like so. Here is the end of the parody music, now leading to this stirring march. And that glorious F-sharp major procession returned there. With soaring strings. Again, very much a la Espagnole. Antheil knew at this point, when the Germans were defeated at Stalingrad, that the tide of the war was turning. And we'll come back again in a few minutes to see how all of this ends. Now, a few miles away from Antheil's office at the Daily News, a certain Igor Stravinsky receives a telegram from Mr. Billy Rose himself, the cigar-chomping poor man's Diaghilev, with an offer that Igor couldn't refuse. Rose is putting together a brand new, super spectacular Broadway revue in the style of the famous Ziegfeld Follies. It's called The Seven Lively Arts. And he asks Stravinsky to compose a 15-minute ballet to add a little class to his extravaganza. The Seven Lively Arts will be a multi-act show that includes highbrow actress Beatrice Lillie, lowbrow comedian Bert Lahr, you know him, I'm afraid there's no denying, I'm just a dandelion, a fate I don't deserve, etc. The show also included the King of Swing, Benny Goodman, and his band. There was new music by Cole Porter, including a song written specially for this production. This excellent song. Every time we say goodbye, I die a little. Every time we say goodbye, I wonder why, a little, written for this show. And in the true vaudeville tradition, there were songs and skits and comedy routines. There was a chorus prepared by a young Robert Shaw. There were new paintings by Salvador Dali in the lobby. And somewhere amidst all of this, a short ballet by Igor Stravinsky, who undertook the assignment with a certain amount of eyeball rolling, I'm sure, but managed to produce a delightful lyrical work in his best neoclassic cum Broadway style, which he called scènes de ballet, or ballet scenes, keeping it very simple. And a major part of the charm of scènes de ballet is the way that it captures the exciting, colorful Broadway theater scene of that legendary wartime era that produced, among other things, Rodgers and Hammerstein's Oklahoma and Leonard Bernstein's Fancy Free and On the Town. Scènes de ballet begins with bold, declamatory chords from the full orchestra, but in a very odd meter of 5 quick beats to the measure. And soon we hear a gentle dance. Still, though, in the 5-beat pattern, like so. I will attempt to count it as I play. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. It's very sweet, but it's very intricate. And it continues. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 1, 2, 3, 1, 3. And 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Now, during the preview performances in Philadelphia, Stravinsky gets a telegram from the choreographer Anton Dolin, very well-known dancer. Dolin confesses that he had cut this entire opening dance, which is like a quarter of the ballet, which sent the composer into a rage. So Stravinsky called the show's conductor, Maurice Abravanel, who became the longtime music director of the Utah Symphony, you may know, who explained to Stravinsky that the dancers in the show were Broadway hoofers who could tap you a mean soft shoe, but they could not get the hang of Stravinsky's 5/8 meter. So the music now proceeds in its odd mix of modernity and Stravinskyized musical theater, including a sparkling, dainty little dance that sounds almost like a parody of tiptoey ballerinas flitting about the stage. But what's odd about this frothy little dance is it ends on what we call a major 7th chord, and we know this. There's the 7th, which gives the music an unusual zing for the split second that it lasts. And this major 7th chord will become very important at the end of the work. The next dance sounds as if Stravinsky might have been doing a bit of tone painting, which he said that music could not do, certainly not his music. And when he first played this section for the 2 lead dancers, they thought that the delicate flute and piano notes sounded like stars falling from the sky over Broadway, which Stravinsky later scoffed at in his memoirs. But listen to it. Okay, whatever. But what follows sounds unmistakably to me like the bustle of downtown New York traffic, complete with a hint of car horns, like Gershwin's American in Paris. Yes, ladies and gentlemen, despite these difficult times, America is on the go. Here we see the excitement and color of good old New York City and Broadway, the great white way in all its dazzling beauty. And look, there's Noel Coward and Mary Martin coming out of the theater. Yes, you can't beat fun in New York City. Why not visit us and bring the whole family? Is it possible that Stravinsky, contrary to his protestations, might have been susceptible to the same common influences of music as the rest of us mortals? I ask this because we now encounter the central dance of scène de ballet, a slow lyrical pas de deux for the two main dancers, and the section which created the biggest controversy. For here, Igor Stravinsky actually wrote a straightforward, beautiful, expressive theme in C major, played by a solo trumpet. It's like a Broadway ballad. Boy, could this guy write a melody or what? Then there's a goofy little passage, a trio with a violin and tuba. But the gorgeous trumpet melody returns in a full, grand, romantic version, unlike anything that you would ever imagine came from the pen of Igor Stravinsky, who later tried to disown this. But too bad, Igor. It remains a part of your legacy. You should be proud of it. And it was this passage that prompted both Billy Rose and Dolan, the choreographer, to urge Stravinsky to beef up the orchestration here so that the ballet would have that really big moment that audiences expected. Dolan said that the preview performances had been a great success, but that beefing up the orchestration would produce a tremendous result. Stravinsky promptly wired conductor Abravanel and refused to consider the suggestions to, quote, obtain a tremendous success, being entirely satisfied with the merely great success that Dolan mentioned. A very witty exchange, which Stravinsky recalled a bit differently in his memoirs, but this is how it read: the telegrams reveal all. And as we approach the end of the work, and believe me, we're headed for something very significant, we hear a section that Stravinsky called stylized jazz, with its breezy rhythm in the strings and the agile clarinet melody a la Benny Goodman. And that rising melody, 1, 2, will now be transformed into the remarkable finale, the apotheosis of this ballet. Stravinsky said that he envisioned a stage full of groups twirling and mounting, deliriando, a luminous, swirling sort of visual effect accompanied by music that perfectly suggests this, but which seems destined to rise far above the merely picturesque. And that rising theme from the jazz dance is now heard in the oboe and bassoon. It's all on the offbeats, surrounded by shimmery strings that create a radiant, suspended effect. Here is a part of this finale. The music continues to rise. It sounds more ecstatic, like it's leaving behind the more mundane popular elements of this score. And it hesitates, becomes more dissonant. Then it continues its ascent. And as we sense where the music is heading, the effect is almost overwhelming. remember how that dainty little dance earlier ended with that split-second major seventh chord? Now, as Stravinsky builds his ecstatic final climax in Scène de Ballet, he will use that most intense and, yes, emotionally charged device. Now it's a C major seventh chord. In a most extraordinary way, as he completes this work in June of 1944, and significantly, like George Antheil, Stravinsky is also following the war news over the radio. So hold that thought. But let's jump back across town to Mr. Antheil, whose Fourth Symphony was given its premiere by Stokowski in the NBC Symphony in February of 1944. And as the tide of the war had turned in favor of the Allies, Antheil said that he felt, quote, the dawn of a wonderful hope up ahead, not too distant to be invisible. But he continued, the emotions that beset composers are rather beyond words. That is the reason one writes music. And before we hear the end of the symphony, I will mention that I've conducted the finale of the Antheil Fourth 6 or 7 times, and almost every time the orchestra members thought that I was insane for doing it. Once I included it on a Pops concert. But in every case, after I had told the audience the story of Antheil and why he wrote the music, the audience would go wild at the end. In fact, once my wife was seated in the balcony with a whole group of seniors, all of whom had lived through the war years as young people. And she said that when the music ended, everyone up and down the row was wiping tears from their eyes. But don't tell any of this to Mr. Igor Stravinsky. Oh, no, no, no. The man who explicitly wrote that music has no ability to convey emotions. Music is only able to solve musical problems, nothing else. Not the literary, not the picturesque. End of discussion. But when we last left his curious, conflicted Broadway ballet, something odd was happening. The finale seemed to be ascending into some vibrant, luminous space. And again, our ears sense where the music is headed. So maybe what we're now hearing from June of 1944 is all mathematics, the abstract, complex, meticulously devised experiments of a musical brainiac named Stravinsky, far removed from us mere mortals and our sentimental cravings, as he put it. And now, as the music moves inevitably to its conclusion, there is the C major 7th chord, almost jarring in its effect, with the addition of the note B, this same chord, hammered by the full orchestra, blazing in its intensity, something far more profound, I think, than twirling dancers on the stage, as Stravinsky had described. then Stravinsky reveals something extraordinary. Quote, "The Apotheosis, the final passage of the ballet, was composed on the day of the liberation of Paris from the Nazis." And indeed, on the last page of his score, Stravinsky wrote, "Paris n'est plus aux Allemands." Paris is no longer of Germans. And so the curious story of Stravinsky and George Antheil reaches its zenith, you might say, both for health reasons, living in Los Angeles, both involved with the entertainment industry, attempting to make a living while still maintaining their artistic dignity, both caught up with the patriotic fervor of the war, both following day by day the turning of the tide as America entered the conflict and ultimately became the key to saving the world. And apparently, both composers expressing themselves. Yes, both of them, through their music. For as Stravinsky later recalled, "I remember that I interrupted my work on the finale of the ballet every few minutes to listen to the radio reports. I think my jubilation is in the music." I think that the jubilation in the music that Stravinsky mentions would definitely qualify as emotion. Thus, Antheil and Stravinsky were, like most artists, united by their humanity. Antheil consciously devoting himself to the war effort, reporting, writing, inventing, composing, and Stravinsky laboring under his own claims that music was incapable of expressing anything emotional. Yet, in the final pages of his maligned, out-of-place Broadway ballet, he scaled the heights of exalted musical expression as the tide of history turned from darkness to light, and in doing so, he created what might just be one of his true masterpieces. A postscript to our story. George Antheil would go on to make a modest living writing 2 or 3 film scores a year. And from the sound of his 4th Symphony's finale, I'd say he was ideally suited to the task. And that Spanish phenomena would continue to attract Antheil. His Hemingway ballet, Capital of the World in 1953, and in 1957, his final film score, The Pride and the Passion, a spectacular film made in Spain, which dealt with the Napoleonic Wars and a huge cannon that the Spanish peasants haul across the countryside to combat the French. No computer effects in this. The film's big action scenes are unbelievable. The casting was a bit controversial, with the Spanish resistance leader played by old Blue Eyes himself, Frank Sinatra. But he does a fine job, if you can forget that he's Frank. And producer Stanley Kramer knew exactly the right man to compose the score for his Spanish epic, George Antheil. And one of the film's major impressive scenes involves a huge Holy Week celebration at night, with Antheil composing a glorious choral processional, possibly influenced by Stravinsky's Symphony of Psalms finale that we've heard. And considering the level of quality with which he accomplished this assignment, Antheil's Pride and the Passion score may be the most dynamic, colorful, and substantial work that he ever produced. Antheil died 2 years later in 1959, far outlived by Stravinsky, who also in 1957 saw the very successful premiere of his ballet AGON with his colleague George Balanchine. The title AGON refers to contests or games in ancient Greece, and Stravinsky's ever-inventive, ever-youthful score is a compendium of colorful musical inventions and games. And in one brief dance, a French Renaissance dance called the Bransel, Stravinsky once again experimented with those intersecting cross rhythms that continued to fascinate him. This Bransel seems to have migrated to Spain because its steady, unchangeable rhythm is played by castanets in a slow triple meter, da 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 da, while the woodwinds and the harp cut across this figure in meticulously designed patterns. Once again, just like the examples that we saw earlier, you look at the score and you say, wow, this guy is brilliant. But also, once again, it makes no difference in the way that the ear perceives it. And this time, Stravinsky's longtime champion, conductor Ernst Anserme, himself a brilliant mathematician, really called out Stravinsky, describing this, quote, deliberate calculation, a defect of intellectual creativity, unnecessary, and adding nothing to the substance of the music. So there is the opinion of a highly qualified expert. But that's just the way Stravinsky was. This is how he perceived things and how he worked them out. So you have to allow him his occasional eccentricities. After all, he did change the entire course of music in the 20th century. So where does this leave us? The story of Igor Stravinsky and George Antheil, two artists whose musical skills were vastly different, despite their many similarities. Stravinsky and Antheil both grew, flourished, and survived by confronting the world and its culture into which they ventured, a world that is long gone and will never be seen again. And so, we're left with their music. Prehistoric ballet, puppet ballet, mechanical ballet, ancient Greek ballet, bullfighter ballet, among many other works. No way am I suggesting that these two composers' music was equal in terms of its quality. One of them was definitely dwarfed by the other. Still, I hope you'll agree that this side-by-side chronicle of their careers and their music is as fascinating as it is unbelievable. Thank you.